All right. Welcome to today's Founding Conversation episode in collaboration with the Royal Academy of Arts, where we'll discuss urban architecture, asking how do cities that we make in turn make us? My name is Cynthia Gorman-Shem. I am the Chief Operating Officer of Pictet Asset Management, and I will be moderating this conversation. Today, we have the privilege of holding this conversation live from the major retrospective exhibition Light Lines, the architectural photographs of Hélène Binet at the Royal Academy of Arts, one of Europe's oldest established art institutions here in the heart of London. The Royal Academy of Arts has celebrated over 250 years of what we see here, real art, and today's topic around cities in their original design, but also their organic and often uncontrollable and unpredictable evolution and the way that we each see those things. I am delighted to welcome today three special guests. First, the Swiss-French photographer Hélène Binet, whose internationally acclaimed work is all around us. We see some striking black and white photography behind us. Hélène is one of the leading architectural photographers in the world and most known for her work with well-renowned architects such as Daniel Libeskind, Zumthor and Zaha Hadid. We're also joined by James Cheshire, Professor of Geographic Information and Cartography at the University College of London, co-author of books London, the Information Capital, Where the Animals Go, and The Atlas of the Invisible. And finally, we welcome Zsolt Kohalmi, Global Head of Real Estate and co-CEO of Pictet Alternative Advisors, and he brings 2 decades of experience in pan-European investment in real estate, over 20 billion US dollars in about 20 European countries. So thank you for joining us today. We will start talking about the cities, how we see them, and in particular, maybe one question for all of you to open the conversation. If you could tell me, what is your favorite city and why? Hélène.
It's a wonderful question, but also difficult. But I grew up in Rome, so it's the city that I love the most. And why? Because of the stratification of culture and how you see an evolution of a city from being, a place where not far away the Etruscs have been starting their life, then the Roman, and then from then you had the Middle Age, and then you had the Renaissance, not so much, but a little bit, and the Baroque, and then it's wonderful to see. And it's still a city which has a human scale, which is important.
All right.
So I'm sure I have a bit of a romantic view, but and it's not so hard to be a young artist and make you living in Rome, but it's been so important for me. So.
Amazing city.
Yeah.
James?
Well, I think I should say London, because that's my home city, and I've lived here for well over a decade now and grew up not far from here. I mean, I think as a city, it's something that, is incredibly vibrant, incredibly diverse in terms of the different, neighborhoods you live in and places you visit, and rich in its history. And I think that's something that I've reflected on quite a lot in, the last couple of years or so, particularly as the city itself is much quieter in the center. And I didn't think I'd miss that hustle and bustle, but actually I do. And I'm so looking forward to hopefully, seeing the city's rebirth again, perhaps, as the pandemic restrictions hopefully begin to lift in the coming months.
And hopefully we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. Thank you. Zsolt?
Thank you. I'll break the rule immediately because I'll say 3, but I'll try to be very brief. With my heart, it's Rio. I think that the city's natural aspect makes it something super special. And so despite the disparity in social incomes and so on, it's just one arrives in Rio and you feel special the moment you're there. London to live, because I think the diversity, the fact that you feel like it's an agglomeration of many villages and you can get, if you're a cosmopolitan person, London is unrivaled, I feel. and the future for Singapore. I really think Singapore has many of the architecture, perhaps will address that inspires a way we need to think going forward.
Interesting, great. Indeed, very amazing cities, all of them, and there's a lot to be seen in these cities. Maybe, Hélène, coming to you a little bit on why you chose photography on the architectural side. Can you tell us a little bit about what brought you to what you do today?
Sometime in life, you make decisions when you're quite young and you don't rationalize completely. It's not like now that you put together facts and you really on paper, but that it happens. It happens that I grew up in Rome, and there must have been an inspiration, that I had a very free education, so walking around, drawing, modern learning curriculum was very important. The academic side of life wasn't easy because I'm quite dyslexic, so being creative was important. And then I moved to London and met wonderful architects. That one became my husband, one was the Dean of Architecture Association, and loved photography, loved books, and gave me the opportunity of photographing architecture where I haven't done any architecture photography. Normally, to have such a position, you need a big portfolio and say, can I get a job? But he just said, Hélène, let's do it. So we did Leverance, we did Hedwig, we did Pictionis. And for me, it was like an explosion. I felt so comfortable in that dimension. I worked in a theater in Geneva for 2 years. I had done advertising, I'd done portrait, but it was just not me. And then suddenly it happened. So luck is also important, and intuition.
Indeed. Yeah. And in your work, what would you say is the difference between photographing more architectural works versus more rural areas? You've done both?
Yes, I mean, in the end, I'm interested in space and how space reflects our dream, our hope, and can also be a way of measuring things that we cannot measure. And it is not the architecture really as an architect would be interested. Of course, I have concern about how people live and the quality of life, but the way I photograph, it's more how to think about questions that we all have in our life. So that's why I'm interested in space. And I love the landscape when I found the same dimension, when you kind of started to think, why do we have this desert? What do we see, where it is coming from? What was the creation energy of a lava coming and making the land that we see? So I think it just vast, but it is the same interest that I have in a landscape than in architecture. So in architecture you see landscape, and in landscape you see architecture.
Yeah, that's a very good good transition to an even other side of seeing cities and architecture. But James, can you tell us a little bit the role of cartography in understanding the architecture of cities and rural areas as well?
Well, I think, maps, in the same way that photos do, they offer a snapshot of the world, and they offer a window into it. And when you look at a map, it does two things. One, it can reflect what's there. So the city footprint can be a factual statement in many ways about what is there, roads, rivers. But it can also be a political statement, or it can reflect power dynamics and tensions and things like that. And so it's not a passive thing, it's actually an active thing, and decisions get taken off the basis of maps, where buildings might be constructed, for example, or areas that might be renewed and that kind of thing. And in that sense, it's a bit more of a conversation, and I really enjoy that aspect of sharing maps, with creating maps and sharing them and having conversations. And that aspect for sure is something that we sometimes take for granted, I think, when we look at a map, but they are really an essential part of cities and where we live, and that's true of rural areas too, of course, because they may not stay rural forever, or they may reflect these sort of deep histories of what happened in those particular places.
Interesting. And maybe to make the connection with what you see, Zsolt, on the investment side. So we've seen some visual, amazing artistic work, cartographic depiction of cities. So how do all of this together, from your perspective, how does that input into how much real estate is worth and investing on real estate?
Well, I think I think as James mentioned, there's a lot of data involved in maps for how you look at cities. And of course, real estate investing is about data. You take a lot of data points that allow you to locate where you believe growth will come. And you can see, for example, on heat maps where more people pass by, where more people perhaps come at certain times of day and so on. And these can be helpful in terms of identifying areas that are up and coming. Shoreditch 10 years ago, or King's Cross prior to the large development, perhaps are good examples. But I think that's the data element of real estate. Then comes the other element, which is, I think, in another life I would have been an architect myself, is the aesthetics. And if you create something of desire, more people will want to work, live, or do whatever in that building. And so the aesthetical side is very important for real estate, because that creates the emotion, which in turn can have a real value and hopefully a positive impact on the city as well.
Indeed, and on the aesthetic side, I think we can turn to Hélène here. You have got commissioned work by some of the world's leading architects, and you have not just photographed the buildings or the architecture itself, but parts of it that actually bring out the soul and life of buildings. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like working with architects like Zaha Hadid, Peter Zumthor, and how your artistic imprint came through the work you did with them?
I've been very lucky to meet them, and very lucky also that they gave me the trust to suggest it would be wonderful if we can work together. They are two very different characters in a sense. The relation with the image is very different, and like Zaha Hadid loved my work and really wanted me to photograph, even if I am quite in another perspective of her work, and it's kind of slow details and very anchored, very earthy. But I believe there was something she recognized of herself in her work. And she always said, I really want you to work with me, but I like 100 of photographer will give a different view of my work. And that was very liberating, because let's say the A to Z of a building is done. I don't need to show the entrance and the rest done. And for me, that's wonderful, because that's what I'm interested in. And I can really look for why she's making the building, what is behind her energy, what is her dream, how did she get there, what was the decision, what does it mean, that building. And with Peter Zumthor, it's the opposite. Doesn't like publication, says space is space. If you want to know my building, go there. You got to hear, you got to feel, you got to be cold or warm, touch the water, I'm in the middle of a mountain, I'm in a city, this is my building. And of course, it's completely right. My photography has nothing to do with space. I'm not the building. I'm a photographer. I'm a photographer, first of all. I have my eyes, I have my view. What can I do? It's B-dimension. But he loves books. And I think books are a very beautiful way of talking about space. The unfolding of the page, and the way you remember something you've seen before, and the way you leave white page to imagine, and the way you... And early on, we had this wonderful collaboration with Lars Müller, where we make the first kind of book where his work was all together. With Lars Müller is also a designer, he's almost an artist in a sense, in the way he works with designer, and together we create that book. So it was completely different way of working, but really about celebrating ideas first of all.
One of the questions I always get asked when I give talks is, why are you making a book? All the data you're looking at is dynamic, it's moving, it's changing, cities change. Make it a website, make it a service, don't make it a book. And we're always very resistant to doing that, because I think it captures precisely that tension that you've just talked about between can you ever capture the essence of a place or a space in a single image? Well, no, you can't capture all of its complexity. And equally, there are many different perspectives, right? So you could have 100 different ways of looking at a particular area. And I think one of the amazing things about books that you've just articulated that is the idea that you can control the experience in a sense. You can give the breathing space for the reader, and actually, in our case, the page size is fixed, the margins are fixed, the resolution is fixed, and we can optimize precisely for that image on that page. On a website, people are fighting for, is it going to be viewed on a phone? Is it going to be viewed on a 27-inch monitor? All that kind of thing. And that essence gets lost, that kind of physicality of the object. And that's, I'm really, pleased to hear you say that, because that's precisely why we still push to create books, because they have that power that you can't really get any other way, I think.
But also, that was one of the questions I thought I could have to you, because your map are very beautiful, and you talk about this, hidden world that we want to reveal. But I think, and your work is based on data. But what's the role of imagination? Because you make beautiful map. So I think in your work, the role of imagination is very important. It's not only about receiving information and with the numbers. You want somebody to create his own world. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And I think we often view maps as these factual statements of impartial perspectives, but they're not. And you have to create, or you have to make creative decisions about what goes into them. And I think, when I walked around here and looking at your work, I was struck by the similarity in a sense that, you have an entire building in front of you and you choose to focus on one part of the building and give it a different perspective. When I was here before, there was a family discussing, I forget where it is, but the image you have of a bridge. Yeah. Is it a trick of the eye, the steepness of the bridge, or is it the bridge really that steep? How the car's driving over it, and there was this whole discussion taking place. And you're playing with people, giving that perspective. And we can do exactly the same thing with data. Imagine our database is the building. We take a decision that we're going to look at this part of it, and we're going to depict it in this particular way. And that is crucial. And I work very closely with my co-author, Oliver Uberti, who's a designer and trained artist. And what's different about our relationship is we work equally to one another. So it's not me as an academic churning out some stuff that he then has to make look visually engaging. Every step of the way, we are interrogating each other on the process and bringing that creativity in. And I think that's a really important aspect of what we do.
And when I was trying to put together some thought, I thought what is in common with us is the power of the frame.
Yeah.
It's the frame, because making a map is making a frame. It's making a frame on a topic, on the size, when I see, how do you stop, how deep you go, how back. Well, it's exactly the same than photography. And this is quite of a beautiful concept, that to understand the world, you need to frame, you need to reduce, you need silence, you need to get into one aspect.
But you also get our attention drawn to your view, and you get some questions coming out of this. I think you mentioned it in terms of the family that was looking at it, and I think that's a real power.
And for me, it's more important that I open a question that I feel, oh, I know that, and I leave. Because you haven't imagined anything. If you say, oh, this is bad, okay, I know this is, no, you don't know, because actually that little line of light, it's a window 6 meters wide. And I made it into a little line. It's not the building. So if I can raise question, and the moment you have question, you make your own space in your brain, like when you read a book, you imagine cities and landscape like in dreams. And this is the most powerful tool, I think, that I can use to communicate something.
Indeed. And Hélène, maybe on the topic of cities, you once said every time you photograph a space, there's a history. And often this history is connected to the city. How has your experience been about photographing older cities versus newer cities. And do you have a preference for contemporary cities? Can you tell us a bit more about that, the contrast?
I never worked a lot with cities. Once I was invited to have a small exhibition at the School of Architecture in Harvard, and then I had to talk about cities, and it was a wonderful subject. It's very difficult for me as a photographer to understand where the city starts and finishes. Is it the transport system? Is it the dream of the people? Is it the surface of the building? Is it the quality of life? Where is the city? So if I will have to encounter a reflection on the city, I will have to really frame very much, because a city is everything. It's us being happy or unhappy, struggling, growing, meeting diversity. So I don't think I am only a nostalgic because I grew up in Rome. I like contemporary city. I like new space, because our future is about creating more quality space where you have capacity of living well together with diversity, respect for the nature. So if I see this, it is something inspiring, and to understand where it is happening. It can be little details that reveal the rest.
Perhaps just a very quick thought to that, Hélène, is just interesting. We're at the World Economic Forum, I'm involved with the decarbonization of the built environment, and one of the most interesting thoughts there that came up was, we real estate people tend to think we are the city because everything is buildings, but actually there is no solution without public transportation. There is no solution without the electricity that has to come from wherever it may come from, that actually powers all the buildings and all the people getting around. So, and you put many more layers on it. There's actually the people in the city that need.
Yes.
But it's just interesting that any solutions that we provide to cities are so multi-layered that it gets very complicated very quickly. So where the city begins and ends is
it's also the
very,
power
very
coming, the gas coming from Russia, the electricity coming hopefully from sustainable source. This is the city. So
indeed,
it's definitely.
And some cities have evolved significantly in the past few years. And maybe I turn to you, James, where you have mapped in your last book Shenzhen and what it was like in the 80s versus what it's like nowadays. And it's striking to see the difference between a very much of a landscape map compared to a very gray and built city. Can you tell us maybe how you see that side of things, having over history? We talked about history and how cities grow. But the role of cartography in older cities versus newer ones.
Well, that map actually, or there's a kind of a pair of maps, actually a couple of images. It's one of the few examples in our book where we just took satellite imagery. So you have there's a satellite called Landsat, but basically it's been going for a long time, for decades, and so you can take these snapshots over long time periods. And we just chose to take two of those and frame those snapshots prior to urbanization and post-urbanization. I suppose it's still ongoing. And we thought that was all we needed to do for that, because the comparison tells enough of the story. The amount of land that's been reclaimed as they move extend out into the Delta area, or the new bridges, or the extent to which what was green agricultural land has become urbanized. And I think that is a fascinating tension between some of the developments you see in China compared to the development you might see in London. There's just no way that kind of rapid development would happen. And I think it's very interesting different set of kind of cultural perspectives on what works and what doesn't. And I think that's partly why we chose that approach, that imagery approach, to show just what had happened, because I think any kind of digitization of city boundaries and all that kind of stuff, it's just impossible to capture what was there. So we just thought, we'll just show the image, and then the reader can pore over it, can do the side-by-side comparison, and imagine what it must be like to be in the place decades ago and be in the place today.
Indeed. And just like in that example, we had pretty much very little or nothing, and it has developed quite a bit in the past few years. There's been a big transformation in cities as well, where the old is replaced by the new. And maybe, Zsolt, to come to you on the investment side, how do you view the value of, you know, some historical buildings that have unfortunately been destroyed because of, you know, the money some of these new developers are making? How do you bring that perspective into investing and valuing?
I think that the pandemic has been terrible, but one thing it's done is it's brought a bit more conscious to people, I think, about many things. And one has been a realization, which I've been trying to speak of for a while, but I think our whole industry is now very awake to, is that real estate is a very big contributor to carbon emissions. It's about 40%, which is, you know, we are the major emitter. And of that 40%, 45% of all emissions happen upfront when you build a new building. And so the embedded carbon of demolishing a building, and by the way, where that goes to, what landfill the materials go to, and then building a new building, this is a very inefficient and bad for the earth way to think about our urban environment. And I have to stress, it's in the developed world because, as James mentioned, you know, China is on a different, and all of Asia is on a different spectacle. There you need new buildings because they simply didn't have the historical buildings in most instances, including in Shenzhen. And so, but within a European and American context, you know, we need to start thinking about refurbishing and repurposing existing buildings, hopefully in a smart, in an architecturally interesting, but also in an environmentally friendly way. And this process is ongoing. This is what we're discovering. It's very artisanal because there's no set of easy rules that allow for a transformation of historical buildings into modern environmental footprint and modernly used buildings. So we have to use creativity and artisanal ideas, but I think that trend is going to be very big, and especially when we will start paying for embedded carbon emissions, because when we realize the cost of building a new building from in an overall standpoint, including the environment, I think we'll have less of what you just mentioned.
Indeed. And I think the challenge also is, as you are describing in the older cities, trying to see a little bit the invisible, which you bring very well, Hélène, with your pictures. And maybe just, James, a question for you on cartography. You talked about London being your favorite city, and you know how such a fast-paced and crammed city as London has also not only history but also hidden buildings. And what I've seen since I've moved here is also the contrast in between an old building all of a sudden with a new development right next to it, or where they've managed to keep the facade and then you know, do things in the back to really keep that soul of the city going. But can you tell us maybe a little bit more about your Atlas of the Invisible and how to see the invisible through cartography in London and more in general?
Well, I think you know, we are interested in how data can reveal things that we can't easily and ordinarily see. And we say that data often renders things invisible. So we collect loads of it. You know, we all have a mobile phone that's collecting data about us, but we can't access it. And there's two problems with access. One is you need to have be an expert in data often to access it. But the second thing is there's so much of it, it's very hard to comprehend. And in the same way that, you know, Hélène takes a picture of a small part of a building and gives her view and helps the viewer into your eye to how you look at things, we do the same with data. And the idea is that we can extract billions of numbers and we can render them in a way that people can understand and interrogate. And I think that that's really what, you know, making the invisible visible is about for us. It's taking something we can't otherwise see, but we have data on, and visualizing it in a way that, you know, people will be able to engage with and crucially interrogate and start to ask them their own questions about what we're showing, and, you know, whether, for example, some of the graphics we have on carbon emissions, you know, whether that's a world we wish to continue or whether actually we're at an inflection point where we can stop doing what we're doing and we can take decisions to help improve things, going forward.
Indeed. And Hélène, in your case, you bring out the invisible maybe through photographing hidden churches and parts of buildings that are hidden in the back. Can you tell us a little bit more about, what draws you to these invisible or, more in the background?
Like I said in the beginning, because there's a sense of impossibility also, really talking about space, I think what interests me is not to represent, but is to give the possibility of grasping dimensions which are hard to grasp. And of course, size of the universe, who we are, where we are, religion. I'm not religious, but I believe for many people understanding, spirituality. So these are the matter that has been always embedded in buildings, in places, and I try to bring them out somehow as a moment of reflection because of tangibility by this process of reducing, by process of poetry, and inviting the imagination to have its role. Like, let's try to go back a bit to China, these walls of the Suzhou Garden, a city which is it's been protected more than other cities. I think it's quite complex. China, I think they destroyed a lot, but maybe also the notion of history is different than our notion of history. So keeping is a new process. Before, it's not the same. And I realized photographing the garden that I could not put a date because they kept being adjusted somehow, but you cannot say it represents this dynasty or this period, like you say, it's a Renaissance garden or it is a Baroque garden. It's not the same notion of history, and it takes time for us to grasp these dimensions. And the garden was a desire to have a meditation of the power of a wall, a limitation, that in that case, there's a lots of history and story, why those gardens, who were the owner, and what was the role of the walls. But it is a place where your body cannot go anymore when you have an obstruction, so the mind starts to go and start to dream. And I was quite lucky to realize, to discover that it's so humid. My first idea that I was going to go, because some people call the theater of shadows, those walls. There's a lots of story about this garden. And coming from my history of Mediterranean, I thought, that's going to be beautiful. Over a day, I'm going to have all the different shadows of the building and the plants. And then when I went there, I said, no, I'm coming with my own. This is not about shadows. This is about very subtle changes and what the humidity does. And then also I had professors telling me, you will never understand our garden because it's coming from such an old Chinese tradition that it comes from a calligraphy, and the calligraphy comes from poems, and then it comes from an old painting. And then when I saw this moss, I said, this feels like a painting, I don't understand, but I do feel. So this process of maybe not understanding completely a culture, but feeling it is very important.
What is that, why you used color in these pictures more than black and white?
Yes, bit by bit. I always use color as one moment of the experience of space, not the only one, but one moment, because if we turn the light off now, the color is gone.
Yeah.
The color is given by light. So I always think it's one moment, and interesting, you can also start to study how the eye works and which part of the eye see the color, which is one small fraction after the black and white one we see. So, and the part that see more black and white, they are the one that gives that direction, so maybe space. So there's a lot of kind of playful theory that I have. But then recently also by feeling also more free and creative, and during the lockdown, I started to love colors and being very attracted about what color does to us as an emotion.
Can I just ask about a sense of giving people a sense of scale? So one of the things we talk about in the start of our book is that, the invisible can be too small to see, such as DNA, or too large to comprehend, like a black hole. And I think, particularly the images behind us here, when I look at them, I thought there's no sense of, these could be this big, or they could be,
a field.
Yeah, they could be huge. And so I just, in terms of your process, I mean, is that, something that you're very consciously trying to do to almost disorientate us about the scale we're looking at in order that we look more closely in many ways? Or is it almost an artifact of, the way that you do it, you're consciously trying to do other things?
I mean, when you work, there's always an intention, of course, and then there's always things that happen that you don't control because you have an emotion, because it's new, or because something you've done in the past. But I will say that I'm not interested to describe. So the moment I'm not interested in describing, easily you lose the scale, or that's why there's not many people in my photograph, because I'm not interested to kind of have immediately that proportions that bring you also to a narrative, and it is a desire to see, this can be very small, or it can be a landscape somewhere in the middle of an imaginary country.
And maybe continuing on the invisible, which I think you both described very well in terms of what you do on your side. Zsolt, to you on maybe finding hidden gems within cities. Can you tell us a little bit more, how do you go about it? How do you see the invisible and bring it out when you're an investor?
I think over the years I've learned that one of the best ways is to actually just walk cities and spend a bit of time and try to understand how you feel a city is moving and where things may be up and coming. And then what you realize is that cities do go in similar patterns. There is a similarity in cities over time. And so it's a terrible thing, but people do always use the terminology of certain districts in a different town saying this is the shortage of 10 years from now, or this is the, and you make analogies of where cities may grow, but you need time, and you need time to be able to spend in cities and understand what is, the word that is not liked often is gentrifying, but areas that are up and coming, and why do people move in? There is a lot of data to this, by the way, so there's a lot of artificial intelligence that is thinking that is going in. And for example, if you see that there's more Uber pickups between 5 to 7 p.m. in a location, it normally means that young people are moving in who are going out more. If on Ticketmaster there's more jazz concert orders, again, it normally signifies ahead of time that area may be coming up. The simple one is you look around and you see more coffee shops. You know that an area is coming up, for example. So those are the residential examples. It's something different for offices, but you need time to feel a fabric of a city, which is the luxury that we all try to have, I guess.
In your process, do you first look at the data and then choose where you go and walk around to get a feel for the city? How does that happen?
I wish it could be that straightforward. We're looking for special situations because we need to convert buildings from use and thereby create value. And that normally entails that the process is not straightforward. So sometimes it can be somebody bringing your attention to a building or a neighborhood or a strategy. And sometimes it can be that you actually think of a macro strategy. For example, building greener, again, that's a very big common strategy today. And we're looking at how to build with more timber, which is, that is 100% renewable. So it's incredibly helpful if you build with timber. So that is when the strategy is top down, but very often the strategy can be bottom up because you happen to find an opportunity.
Yeah.
But I just wonder on the data question. I mean, one of the great things about cities is that there's an inherent unpredictability to it, right? So the Shoreditch example is a good one. I don't think that anyone necessarily anticipated the kind of intensity of development that happened in that part of London around the tech industry, for example, and it was there was a rapid response, but it wasn't, anticipated. And in a sense, that was pre-Uber anyway. So I mean, cities developed. London was fine without data, right? And it still existed and developed and grew. And I just wonder, the extent to which data is kind of really driving kind of rational decisions that you're taking, or whether actually it's confirming what you think already?
It's a very fair point, and I think we're on the cusp of the former, and the latter was the case until today. So I think we're using data in real estate is something very new. It hasn't been around for a very long time, and real estate is probably, I would say, it's one of the very last industries to be co-opted by IT, by technology. Everything else, from financial services to medicine, everything else has been. Real estate is the very last bit. I do think increasingly data will play a part in investment decisions even up front, but we're at the cusp of that happening, and it's more confirming the bias. Shoreditch example is a good one. In Shoreditch, actually, what you could see a decade ago was, for example, that the funky, cool retail brands wanted to establish themselves in Shoreditch because they wanted to be associated with being somewhere happening, and so suddenly Shoreditch High Street saw a string of funky, cool brands getting there. You saw that exactly as tech was taking off, you saw that some of the tech tenants went there. Why? Initially because it was lower cost. It used to cost a third of what the city costs right next door. But you saw that that was the reason they went. But then as tech started to climb, the theory that you could make is that they will be able to start paying higher rents, and hence. So Shoreditch you could see, but the data wasn't a clear-cut Excel sheet. It was data points, I would rather say.
And I think that transitions quite well to our next topic, which is around how city architecture is changing, has been changing and is changing. And I think all of you made reference at one point to the current situation with COVID. And maybe a question, Zsolt, for you about how you see the city architecture evolving with the changes that we have been brought about recently around COVID. Remote working, e-commerce, do you see that, if you had a crystal ball, will that continue on and will that transform city architecture, or do you think it would go back maybe a little bit more to the pre-COVID way of living?
I think the term I quite like, and I believe it to be true, is that essentially COVID just merely accelerated existing underlying trends. It's not that COVID did something and we flicked a light and it became dark and we went from black and white to color. I think that we've been having these trends that you mentioned very briefly already, and COVID has greatly accelerated them. Everybody learned how to click and order at home, even the people who were most reticent to do so because they had to. So we had an underlying trend that was going online. In the UK, we went from 25% to 41% online retail as a percentage of total retail in this space of time. And that means that we need to rethink retail spaces. Retail spaces will be more medical-led, I believe, or I should say health-led, medical and soul cycle and everything else. We're going to see more and more space dedicated to people's increased conscious about their medical state. I think for offices is the biggest debate. But I do believe that innovation cannot happen without people meeting each other. 90% of innovation happens in the 10% of time that we're at the coffee machine or somewhere similar. So I believe that offices need to reinvent how they're structured internally. Because of the environment, we need to think, I think Ellen mentioned in the beginning, the difference between city and land. I think we need to bring the outside inside. That's one of the big takeaways as well from the pandemic, that we want to feel like we're more in nature when we're inside. And then, of course, the big trend, which for London is a genuine issue, is that the people increasingly want outdoor space. And so this is a question for mega cities is, will people actually come back to the downtown? Because there has been a very, very significant emigration observed, in particular in mega cities, into the, whether we call it suburbs or neighboring counties or what you may. Personally, I'm a believer in cities. I think that young people will come, but the age is continuously going down, at which time most people do leave the city. So we have this constant flux of young people come in for the experience, for wanting to be together in a very, very intense and crowded environment, but the age level at which they leave the city continues to increase, I believe.
And I think the notion of more green spaces in cities, as you're saying, is also something that has come out even more so during the pandemic, when people living in the cities couldn't go outside and actually had to stay within a few blocks of their area, and without green spaces, it really has become quite difficult. Hélène, have you noticed any difference in terms of the latest work that you've done, or what you think may be coming up through this whole period of pandemic, and has there been a shift for you?
I think this time was, like for everybody, a very reflective time, and then this opportunity came also wonderful to have the exhibition, and how my work would evolve in the sense of personal world, this is still very open. But definitely as a person, we all became more aware of our relation with nature, and from there also the issue from climate. And the city is changing, but also the way of using the city, because I grew up in Italy where people are outside, and now finally you see people outside and I hope it's going to stay. You know, in the front garden they put little chair and they have a cup of tea or a glass of wine in the evening, which this was never seen before. The park are full, so I think, yes, the city have to start not only to put the nature in the building or technology, but considering their outside space in a different way, because maybe that's a more healthy. Build with wood. Wood, it's maybe the future. Build with material that give us another sense of relationship with some dimension that are easy to connect, that may be concrete. And where my work will go, I don't know. But you know, what is going to transform all these considerations, and this is not something I can say now in a kind of, but there's lots of new ingredient.
Yes, indeed. And maybe, James, the role of cartography and gardens and mapping. How do you see that building in terms of, you know, hopefully more sustainable environments that we'll be living in the future?
Well, actually, I think I think more about data and what the data have told us, and how things have changed. And I think there's a couple of things that I might just, you know, reflect on. One is the idea that young people move in and then out of cities. That's always been the case. So London has always had lots of people coming in and moving out. And that's just how the city operates. But it's always been the case that more people have been coming in than going out. And the pandemic, I mean, saw a massive loss of people who were maybe originally from overseas, going back to over there where they were from, or moving out of the city, back with parents, all that kind of thing. And so whether those people return is an interesting question. And I think the other thing that we've spotted in the data that we've been looking at and the research that we've been doing is that lockdown is a privilege for a lot of people, because if you can't work from home, you can't do lockdown, right? So that's one thing. So the people we're talking about here are not the same people. They have different responses to the way things have changed. I think that's important. And the other really significant thing that's come through is the idea that where you live, your neighborhood is really important to you. And I think that has been the big change. People are spending more time at home in their neighborhood. And I think that feeds into green space. So protecting green space near your home, I think, is a really important thing that's happened. But also improvements in the built environment. So, you know, reduction in traffic, or, you know, things like that. And I think that those aspects, I think that's going to be really fascinating to see whether some of the things that we might come into the city for, restaurants, bars, all that kind of stuff, whether that moves out and we have less in the center. And, you know, I think that will be the key thing, whether you mentioned at the beginning, you know, London as a city of villages, effectively whether those villages become more central focal points for the people that live there, or whether we come back to this idea that, you know, London is the center of the galaxy and there's a constellation of places around that people get sucked into the middle of. And I think that's, who knows? I mean, I think that's going to be interesting for the next 2 or 3 years at least.
Well, there's a lot of thought process being put in, and there's a lot of planners. For example, in Berlin, it's a very big movement who would like to encourage the 10 or 15-minute cities. And it goes back to your idea, the village setup that basically you can live, work, and have fun within a 10, 15-minute walking environment. And that's being encouraged by a lot of planners. So you can get planning permission significantly easier if you help add to that dimension nowadays. And personally, because I've left London 3 years ago and I come back more as an occasional visitor, I feel it now. I genuinely feel that there is an increased vibrancy outside of central London and a very noticeably decreased vibrancy downtown. So I guess your point is whether it's permanent or not. But it certainly, for today, it certainly feels that's the trend.
So indeed, COVID has shown us quite a few things throughout this period, but the other topic to look at as well when we look at architecture is climate change and how that has affected and will continue to affect the cities that we live in. And maybe for you, Zsolt, about the climate change and effect on real estate, and in particular maybe some more profound changes like what people are discussing in terms of Venice, and potentially the city being at risk with the water levels increasing. How do you see climate change really impacting real estate in the future, and can we do anything to salvage cities and buildings in the coming years?
Well, I think we can do a lot. The question is, are we going to do it fast enough? I guess is what we're all worried about, because the time is running out, and we have not shown, even during, I think, COVID, to be really good at global efforts of this magnitude. And climate change is a global point. It can't be resolved by a city, by a nation, or by anybody else, except if it's globally resolved. I think your point around Venice, obviously there is a problem of increasing water as temperatures rise and as ice glaciers melt, whether water increases. And there are no solutions really yet. So Venice is one, and in Venice, obviously short term at least, they're trying to keep the cruise ships out. But my favorite example is Miami South Beach, which has record asset prices. The homes have never cost as much as they do today. And yet there's no solution at the moment to the fact that Miami is sinking, because it's on a very sandy table. And the ocean is increasing, so it's going the wrong way. Sooner or later, we're going to, first, second floor flats will have to include scuba gear. This isn't right. So climate proofing cities or buildings individually is a real problem. And one of the things I foresee is I do think that if we don't act fast, and unfortunately, buildings near the sea will decrease in value. At the moment, they have increased a lot because people would like to see a way to get near nature. But these buildings may well decrease in value, and I think people may well shift to mountains again, which used to be the case about 100 years ago when they think about a home of desire. I think that though the overall problem is we need to, again, because we're the largest emitters, 40% of all emissions, we need to do a whole host of things to bring down the emissions of buildings. And so this includes everything from insulation to smart sensors that make sure we turn off the lights when nobody's in the room, or turn off the heating. Very often, most buildings we buy, 40% of all the heating or electricity bills come at nighttime when there's one night guard in. It's amazing how much we do. In the UK, I still find amazing that there's still so many single glazed windows. You're essentially heating the street, which is also a real issue. And we need to electrify a lot of the heat pumps and so on, how we heat and cool buildings. Again, all of these are very big transitions, and the real estate industry needs to work together with governments, need to work together with local councils and so on, for us to create meaningful steps in the timeline that we need to create it. I think the timeline is what mainly worries me, because I see the positive intent, but if we're not going to go quick enough, we're going to struggle. And then lastly, for the developing world, the problem is different. We need new buildings, and so that presents a whole different challenge. wood is one option, but we also need to come up, because in a lot of these places, wood is not always an option. You need something stronger because of the hurricanes, because of many other things. And so we need to come up with more environmentally friendly cement, which is, again, something that many groups are working on, but it's a work in progress.
Is that right, that cement is like the 9 country emit as much as CO2 than in a range of country would be number 9? It's a huge.
I'm sorry.
The production of cement.
Yes,
it's
massive.
It's not known because we think, but it's massive.
It's absolutely massive.
Massive. And how are we going to make bridge and road? And it's a big question.
Yes, and China has come up and surpassed the U.S. by a very, very significant margin, and again, there are various technologies that are looking at decreasing it. Wood, again, I believe, is a really good solution for certain buildings up to a certain height and so on. But
I think they hope to go quite high with wood. Yeah. Bamboo in some countries.
Yes.
Because you have to have something that you can produce quickly.
Yep.
So bamboo is also a nice material.
Alternative materials, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah. But I think there will be lots of interesting challenges. I think in each of your areas in the coming years that may transform also how you invest on your side, the art on your side, Hélène, and how you map the cities. And maybe that's a final question for each one of you. We've looked at different aspects around cities, about the impact of, COVID, sustainability, what you've each seen in terms of the invisible through your different work. If I can ask you, if you can project yourself a little bit, but, we talked at the end about technology. How do you think technology will be impacting what each one of you does? And maybe, Hélène, I can start with you. You're a traditional photographer. How do you believe that your work will be impacted by technology in the next few years, if at all?
I don't think technology will change my work because that's not my tool. Of course, I hope technology can help resolving problems which I'm deeply concerned. That is climate, city, being more a place of life. I worked also quite a lot in Bangladesh and with NGO already 5-6 years ago, where climate was not how to stop, it was only how to protect ourselves, mangrove grove, things, and we are talking about thousands of people that will not have any place to live and will start to migrate. So in technology, in that case, it's to be aware, to know, to maybe help. But in the way I will express concern, the way I will make my work, I don't see it changing. It's like playing the violin all your life. You might play a contemporary piece, but you play your violin. This is your instrument.
You also mentioned something I read about drones and how pictures that are taken by drones of buildings are maybe a different type of...
Yeah, it's just a different...
It's totally different, indeed. How about you, James? How does technology impact, the data and the representations that you do on the cartography side?
Well, I think on a very technical sense, we can do stuff with more data much more quickly. I've been working in this space for over a decade, just over a decade now, and it's extraordinary, even in that time period, what I can work with. But I think in terms of the broader discussion, I think there are two things that I hope will happen. The first is we come to think of data as a positive, not a negative. I think a lot of the debate at the moment is concerns about privacy and impacts of data on negative impacts. And there are many positive things that data can do with the correct safeguards and everything else in place. And so I think that's one thing I'd like to see. And then the second thing is I would like to see more people empowered by data to then hold people, particularly decision makers and policy makers and so on, to account more, because we actually have the tools now which anyone can go on a website and see. So for example, last Friday in London, we hit the top of the scale on air pollution. People were told to reduce exercise because of the air pollution being so bad. That data is free for anyone to look at. And so if the policymakers say we're going to cut air pollution in the next year or 2 years or 3 years, we're going to bring in policies to do that, we, the citizens, can access the data and can actually validate their promises. And I think bringing that in, that advocacy part to the data access part, I think will be a really powerful way as we look to the promises of COP26 and all that kind of thing. So that's what I hope. I think the technology is obviously going to progress and we're going to do things quicker and faster, but I think the idea that data is a positive and something that we can use to push for change, I think that's something I'm really hopeful for in the years to come.
I mean, it's empowering the individual. If it's used properly, it gives you a power to really check things that you read on newspaper or that you hear. If you have the right access, I mean, you're understanding which source you can trust, it gives you power.
Yeah, and crucially, maps are incredibly powerful tools for that.
That's what I was going to say. Your visual representation of the carbon emissions, traveling in the US, it's you see it, and it's not numbers. You're seeing it, and it's touching all of us.
Exactly, and there are many historic examples we don't often think about where maps have changed things for the better. So the pioneers of this were the suffragist movement, particularly in the US. They used maps. They put maps in front of policymakers and said, these guys have given women the vote, these guys haven't. You are the strange ones for not doing it. These ones have done it and it's no problem. And I think getting some of that campaigning, edge that, the suffragists can teach us, I think is good, can really supercharge what we have at our fingertips already. And I'm hopeful that we can, start to see that more in the next few years.
Zsolt, on your side, technology and impact on...
So I think probably my side is where technology will have the most profound, because I just think everything in real estate is being disrupted. Real estate is in the middle of the technology disruption. Again, probably is one of the last industries, because we're very old school in many ways. I think the pandemic has accelerated that. So from hopefully using data, forward-looking data, to actually coming up with smarter AI-led investment decisions, it obviously still enhanced hopefully by the human brain, but I think everything on the investment side will change in my mind. Also how investors interact with their investments. Will they be tokenized, and will there be a much easier way to exchange units as opposed to going to the land registry and every time registering that, hey, I own this building. I think all of that will change, but the key one that I'm hopeful for is around the environment, because I think that is the problem. We know it's here, it's now, and we also know that the technology can actually help us. We can't stop living or working in places. I think that's why for a very long time we didn't appreciate how important our emissions are, because it's seen as a necessity. Mm-hmm. But that necessity doesn't mean that it's still not the largest denominator and not something we need to do about. So I hope that it'll be much more normal that we'll have sensors, we'll realize how the individual building is behaving, and we'll take the appropriate actions to decrease our emissions, because I think that is the one imperative we have if we're thinking a bit longer term for all of us.
Well, thank you all very much for being here and for answering these questions. And if I have one wish, is hopefully maybe in 10 years' time we can meet around another expo from ULN and see how all that we've talked about, how things potentially will be evolving, have evolved, and what has happened since. Thank you once again, and great meeting all of you and discussing these topics.
Thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.